It was a warm summer evening. The air conditioner was broken. Several of the church members had worked hard that morning. They were tired. The preacher had been going strong. He was on fire. He was preaching longer than he ever had before. And he noticed a man on the third row who had fallen asleep. He continued on with his lesson, though. After a few more minutes, the man began to snore. So the preacher started speaking a little more loudly so that he could be heard. The man's snoring became increasingly disturbing, not only to the preacher, but to the whole church. The preacher paused and he asked the gentleman sitting behind the sleeping member to wake him up. That man huffed and he said, "You put him to sleep, you wake him up." There's actually a similar incident in the Bible. Turn to Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, beginning in verse 7. We're in the city of Troas. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together, and in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down, fell on him, and embracing him said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him." Now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted. We talked this morning about the Lord's Supper. We focused on that first part of that first verse there, verse 7. Tonight I'd like to finish the passage and use the rest of that as our study tonight through verse 12. What can we learn from this incident? How can we apply the things that we read here to the way that we worship and the way we prepare to worship? Now, first, there are several lessons to be learned for hearers. When we gather together, different people play different roles in the worship service. There are some who lead in prayer. There are some who lead in singing. There are some who lead in the study of the Word through preaching. There are some who lead our thoughts as we partake of the Lord's Supper, and our thoughts as we consider our financial contributions to the church. There are several men who take turns in those roles. But realize this, even if you are not leading in those acts of worship, you are still participating, or at least you should be. When someone is leading the prayer, we should all be praying along with him where we are. When someone's leading the singing, we should all be singing with him, and so forth. Likewise, when someone's leading the study, when the preaching is going on, we should be listening and following along in the scriptures to the best of our abilities. But there are some, like Eutychus, who have trouble staying awake. We're not told why Eutychus fell asleep here. Perhaps he had worked all day. Remember, we talked about this morning in Troas, it was a Hellenistic city. Sunday was not a special day in that culture. It was special to the Christians, but not to the city at large. It was just another work day. So he may not have had the rest that his body required before they came together to worship. Many times today, we don't know why people fall asleep. Some may have worked all night, perhaps working until 6 or 7 a.m. and still showing up to the services, just a few hours later. There may be some who are on some medication that causes drowsiness. Young mothers may have been up with their children for hours the night before. We need to use great caution before we pass judgment on those who have trouble staying awake. Focus on our own motivations and our own behaviors rather than on others, especially when we don't know the whole story. It's quite admirable for individuals such as these to attend services, even though they may have trouble keeping their eyes open. Let's look inwardly. Let's examine ourselves individually, because we're not going to be judged by what another person does, are we? We're going to be judged by what we do. Did we stay up too late Saturday night watching TV? I had trouble with that when I was a teenager. I loved watching Saturday Night Live. It doesn't go off until 1 a.m. I had some trouble some Sunday mornings staying awake. Did we visit too long with friends on Saturday night? But we need to make proper preparations for worship. Not just making sure that we have clean clothes, but make sure that our physical body is as ready as it can be for the act of worship. And in addition to that, we need to make sure we have clean hearts, don't we? Sometimes it's a heart issue. Perhaps we're just not interested in spiritual matters as much as we should be. It doesn't matter how good the singing is. It doesn't matter how uplifting the prayers are. It doesn't matter how thought-provoking the sermon is. Some just don't care. And if this describes you, you need to wake up. One commentator made the comment that you may never die from a 3-story drop, but your spirituality is plummeting, and spiritual death could be imminent. This does not happen overnight. The words sinking into, there in verse 9. Eutychus was sinking into a deep sleep. This is translated from a present tense Greek word that indicates this state of sleep happened gradually. In a moment, we're going to consider some corrective actions to avoid falling asleep spiritually. But it's not an overnight thing that happens. Let's move on for just a moment, though, and let's consider some lessons for preachers and teachers from this passage. Most of us have at one time or another taught in some way. Some have preached sermons, some have taught Bible classes, others have led private Bible discussions, and we can all learn something from Paul and the other preachers of the New Testament. I've told the joke before, and I'm probably going to tell it again at some point, that we've got an approved apostolic example here of a long sermon. He preached until midnight. So you all get settled in, because we're going to be here for a while. Now, I say that in jest, but there are some who will use Acts 20 and verse 7 to prove that long sermons are scriptural. There's some considerations we need to take here. Notice that Paul, he had not been there the Sunday before. He would not be there the Sunday after. His situation was considerably different from that of preachers who are with the same people Sunday after Sunday. You might start fidgeting if I get past 30 minutes. And I probably would too if I had to listen to myself for that long. But there are some preachers and teachers that we could listen to all night. Partly because we don't have that opportunity every week. If the Apostle Paul were here tonight, you better believe I'd be fighting to keep him here until daybreak tomorrow morning to hear everything he had to say. That's just how it is with people that we don't spend a lot of time with. We want to hear them as much as we can during the opportunities that we have. Preachers and teachers need to work hard to make sure that their lessons do not become lullabies. We have an important task, and it needs to be taken seriously. Brother Mike talked about this a little bit on Thursday night during our Bluegrass Bible Institute. The immense responsibility that teachers have. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, Paul says, preach the word. Be instant, in season, out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching or doctrine. You are not here to hear my political opinions. And I'm not here to tell you what's going on in the world at large. That's not my task. That's not my responsibility. You are here to hear the word, and I'm here to preach it. When we leave this building tonight, we should have a better understanding of something that will help us improve our service to God. Different people may take away different points because not everybody's at the same place, spiritually speaking. But we should have something that will help us, whether that's an improvement in our attitude, or in our evangelistic efforts, or in our behavior, or our demeanor in worship. Generally speaking, it's not going to take me longer than 20 or 30 minutes to get to the point to try to help us to understand something a little better. Occasionally, maybe, but that's going to be the exception, not the rule. The reason that I print the outlines in the bulletin is not only to help you to follow along while we are here, but so that you can take it home and you can remind yourself of what we have studied. And I hope that you're using those in that way as you grow in your Christian walk. Preachers and teachers can learn so much from the examples that we are given in the Scriptures. And students and hearers can learn a great deal as well. We also have something to learn about the worship environment in this passage, don't we? Now, this is going to be a very brief point, so pay attention because we're going to be moving on pretty quickly. Verse 8. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. Could this have played a role in Eutychus' drowsiness? Assuming the best, that he had worked a hard day and he was simply worn out from physical labor. And now he's in a dimly lit room with lamps that were depleting the oxygen supply in this small room. That's a perfect recipe for falling asleep, isn't it? Where the church meets is not of prime importance. But there is value in trying to make the place of meeting as conducive to worship as possible. Through the years, poorly ventilated rooms have contributed to lulling saints to sleep. We need to remove whatever distractions we can to make sure our worship to God is not disturbed by environmental factors. All right, I told you that was going to be a short point. Final point this evening. Eutychus was pronounced dead, but then he was brought back to life. Look again at verses 9 and 10. In a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep. And as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down, fell on him, and embracing him said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him." He fell out of a third-story window. And the physician on scene, Luke, said that he was dead. This was not a mistake on Luke's part. Eutychus was physically dead. But Paul, endowed by the Spirit with the power to work miracles, brought this young man back to life. From a physical standpoint, obviously, this was an amazing incident, one that caused great joy. The understatement of the year is in verse 12, where Luke says, "And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted." They were very comforted, weren't they? There was great joy at this occasion. But how much more joy should be felt when one who was spiritually dead is made alive again in the Lord? What was the problem with the church at Corinth? Mike talked about this a few weeks ago on Sunday morning. The church in Corinth was divided over so many issues: personalities, immorality, legal disputes, marriage, diet, the Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts. They were even divided over their knowledge of God. Why was the congregation plagued with so many problems? Is it perhaps because they had fallen asleep spiritually? 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 30, "For this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep." Don't fall asleep, church. Go back to Romans chapter 13 for a moment. Romans chapter 13, and look at verses 11 and following. Here Paul says, "Do this, knowing the time that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly, as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts." We need to wake up because we face a serious enemy. Satan will try his hardest to divide us, but we will not fall if we stay awake, if we stay vigilant, if we stay united. Remember, Eutychus did not fall asleep all at once. It was gradual. We have to be on guard against slipping into a spiritual slumber and then into spiritual death. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul writes about this. Ephesians 5, beginning in verse 8, he says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light. For whatever makes manifest is light. Therefore, he says, awake, you who sleep. Arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light." Don't fall asleep, church. If you are asleep, wake up. And that's something you have to answer for yourself. Are you asleep? Are you doing the things that you need to do for the Lord? Are you paying attention to your spiritual life, to your struggles? Again, it doesn't happen overnight. We have to continually be on guard. Tonight, as you consider these things that we learn from Acts chapter 20, Paul's time in Troas with the church there, with Eutychus and his situation, If you find yourself lacking, if you find yourself needing to wake up, and you want the prayers of the church, we'd be thrilled to pray with you and for you in that regard. If you've never been baptized to have your sins washed away, that opportunity is yours as well. Tonight, if you need to respond to the invitation, please come now as we stand and as we sing.